High above the Pacific Ocean, where the air becomes thin and silent, a single aircraft climbs toward a place where almost nothing can survive. The engines roar, then soften, then struggle as the cold cuts through metal like a knife. Below, a world is at war. Above, a new kind of battlefield waits. It is a battlefield with no trenches, no shelters, and no safe place to land. Only sky. Endless sky. This is the story of how one machine, the American B-29 Superfortress, changed the shape of the war by flying higher than any Japanese fighter could reach. It is a story not only of engines and metal, but of human courage, human fear, and the deep silence found at the edge of the world. Perhaps this is where it begins, not with a battle but with a simple question. How do you fight an enemy who climbs above your reach? How do you defend a nation when danger comes from a height where your machines cannot breathe? And what does it mean for the people inside those machines, who fly so high that even the air seems to turn against them? As the sun rises over the islands of the Pacific, the sky glows a deep orange. Warm winds move across the water. But high above that calm surface, the temperature drops below freezing. Winds roar at hundreds of kilometers per hour. At these heights, even the strongest engines gasp for air. This is not a place made for humans. It is a place that punishes weakness. Yet during World War II, this place became a battlefield. Japan, spread across islands and mountains, depended on fast, agile fighters like the Zero. These planes were deadly in close combat and unmatched in low-altitude dogfights. Pilots trained for years, mastering sharp turns and sudden dives. But the war was changing. The battlefield was moving upward. The enemy was no longer coming close. The enemy was flying far above, in a cold part of the sky where Japanese fighters began to shake, stall, and fall. When the B-29 first appeared on the horizon, many Japanese soldiers looked up in confusion. It was bigger, heavier, and unlike anything they had seen before. It did not swoop down like the planes they were used to fighting. Instead, it stayed high. Too high. Higher than any standard Japanese fighter could reach without losing power or control. To understand how this was possible, we go back to the early years of the war. America knew it needed a new kind of bomber, one that could travel across oceans and survive long enough to strike targets deep inside enemy territory. Engineers were asked to create something bold, something new, something almost impossible. They were told to reach for a part of the sky no aircraft had mastered. So they created the B-29. It was not just another bomber. It was one of the most advanced aircraft the world had ever seen. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to breathe normally at heights where oxygen was almost gone. Strong engines with turbo-superchargers pushed air into the cylinders, allowing them to keep running in the thin atmosphere. Its long wings gave it lift where other planes struggled. And its frame was built to handle the freezing cold. But even with the best engineering, flying at 30,000 feet was dangerous. The temperature outside could drop to minus 40 degrees. Frost formed on windows. Breathing felt heavy. The engines shook. At any moment, metal could crack and a small mistake could cost a crew their lives. Yet, this was the height that made the B-29 untouchable. Japanese fighters tried to climb up, but their engines began to lose power. Their wings shuddered. Sometimes they simply stopped climbing, forcing pilots to turn back before the cold swallowed them. For the B-29 crews, this high world felt both beautiful and lonely. The sky was clear, almost too clear. The clouds below looked soft like white oceans. Sunlight glowed on the metal wings. But inside the plane, men sat in silence. They felt the cold through their gloves. They heard every shake of the engines. They knew that if something went wrong, there was no rescue, no landing strip, nowhere to run. Only open air and the long fall below. When the first B-29 raids reached Japanese cities, the shock was enormous. Alarms sounded. Fighters scrambled. But each time they chased the bombers upward, they reached a point where their engines began to cough. Their fuel thinned. Their controls stiffened. The pilots could see the bombers, but they could not reach them. It was like trying to grab something just beyond their fingertips. In Japanese command centers, frustration grew. Engineers worked day and night to build new interceptors, new engines, new weapons, anything that could reach the heights of the B-29. Some designs came close, but close was not enough. The sky had become America's shield. Yet flying at that height did not make the missions easy. In fact, many B-29 crews feared the cold sky more than enemy fighters. Winds pushed the plane off course. Oxygen masks sometimes froze. The interior could turn into ice. Men rubbed their hands together, trying to keep feeling in their fingers. Some stared out of frosted windows, wondering how much longer they could handle the silence. Still they flew. Hour after hour. Mission after mission. Sometimes when the bombers appeared over Japan, people on the ground stared upward, watching silver dots move across the sky like slow stars. They could hear the faint hum of engines, but the plane seemed distant, unreachable, unreal. Some felt fear. Some felt anger. Others felt helplessness, knowing the battle was happening far above human limits. And so, the war changed. Not because one side was braver than the other, but because one machine reached a height the other could not. This simple difference reshaped strategies, decisions, and the final months of the conflict. Yet behind every technological victory, there were human hearts, hearts that beat in fear, in hope, in exhaustion. The pilots who flew the B-29s were young men, many barely older than students. They carried heavy responsibility. They knew their missions brought destruction. They hoped they would return home. They feared they might not. The sky, for them, was not only a battlefield, it was a place of quiet reflection. Perhaps this is what the high altitudes taught them. When you fly far above the noise of war, when you look down at the world from a height where all borders vanish, you begin to see life differently. Mountains, rivers, cities, they all blend together. Everything looks small, fragile, temporary. And maybe that is why the story of the B-29 is not just about machines or war. It is also about what it means to rise above something. Above danger, above fear, above the limits of human invention. As the war neared its end, Japan tried one final time to climb toward the B-29s. Pilots pushed their planes higher than ever before. Engines overheated. Wings shook. Some aircraft broke apart in the air. Others stalled and dropped, spinning helplessly toward the sea. Still they tried. They tried because their nation depended on them. But altitude is not something that can be defeated by will alone. Nature has rules. The sky has limits. And above those limits, only a few machines could survive. When the war finally ended, many pilots from both sides spoke of the sky differently. Some said it felt like a living thing, quiet, cold, watching them. Others said it felt like a reminder of how small humans truly are. And some, after years of conflict, could not bear to look at it the same way again. Today, when we look at the B-29 in museums or old photographs, we see a machine of metal and rivets. But behind that machine is a story of ambition and struggle. A story of people who pushed themselves to the edge of what was possible. A story of a sky that challenged everyone who entered it. The B-29 flew higher than any Japanese fighter could reach, not because it wanted to dominate, but because the war demanded a new kind of endurance. A new kind of innovation. A new way of thinking about the sky. In the end, the sky remembers everything. The cold. The courage. The fear. The long flights past clouds and storms. And perhaps, somewhere in that high, silent world, the echoes of those engines still linger, fading slowly into the wind. The sky above the Pacific had become a strange border between two worlds. Below it, nations fought, cities burned, and soldiers struggled for survival. Above it, in the thin, freezing air, another kind of struggle continued, silent, invisible, and deadly in its own quiet way. As the B-29s continued their long missions, the crews learned that flying higher than the enemy did not mean escaping danger. The danger simply changed shape. At times, the greatest enemy was the cold. At other times, it was the loneliness. And sometimes, it was the thought of what their bombs would do once they fell through the clouds. The crew members lived in a metal tube for hours at a time, surrounded by rattling walls and the constant hum of engines. They had to trust those engines with their lives. Every sound mattered. Every vibration meant something. A small change in tone could mean an engine was struggling in the thin air. A sudden drop in temperature could signal that something had frozen. They listened with trained ears the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. And all around them the sky was so clear that it felt endless. At night the stars looked close enough to touch. The moon cast a pale glow over the wings. In the darkness below, Japan slept in shadows, unaware of the silver shapes drifting above them. The crews looked down, knowing their destination. Some were quiet. Some whispered short prayers. Others stared straight ahead, focusing on their instruments, trying not to think about what waited beneath the clouds. What made these flights even harder was the thinness of the air. At high altitude, breathing became a challenge. Even with oxygen masks, the air felt sharp and cold. Talking was difficult. Moving from one part of the aircraft to another meant climbing through narrow pressurized tunnels. The smell inside the plane was a mix of metal, rubber, engine oil, and the faint scent of human sweat. And yet, despite the harsh environment, the crews felt a strange sense of peace in the air above 30,000 feet. There were no loud explosions. No enemy planes buzzing around them. No smoke or chaos. Just silence, until they dropped their bombs. On the ground, Japanese engineers worked around the clock to find ways to reach the B-29s. They studied engine performance charts. They tested new fuel mixtures. They stripped planes of extra weight, hoping to gain a few hundred more meters of altitude. They trained pilots to climb in a straight line until their vision darkened and their engines shook. But the laws of physics were unforgiving. As the air thinned, wings lost lift and engines lost power. Some pilots tried daring tactics. They climbed steeply, then arched upward, hoping momentum would carry them closer. For a moment they could see the bombers above them, huge, slow shapes shining in the sunlight. But in the next moment their plane stalled. The nose dropped. The controls went stiff. And the aircraft fell like a stone. Many never recovered. Those who survived described the feeling as terrifying. The sky above them wasn't just unreachable, it felt like an enemy all its own, pushing them back, denying their efforts, closing the door on their hopes. Back inside the B-29s, the crews didn't see these moments. They only heard short radio messages about attempted interceptions. Most were too far away to be a threat. Others never got close enough to fire. But sometimes, one fighter managed to climb high enough to fire a burst of bullets before falling away. A single burst could tear through the bomber's skin, hit a fuel tank, or injure a crew member. So the crew stayed alert. They scanned the skies constantly. Even at that height, fear stayed with them. One pilot later wrote, "It wasn't the enemy we feared most. It was the sky. It didn't want us there." And he was right. The sky punished every mistake. Even a small error in calculating fuel could leave a bomber stranded with no airbase nearby. If engines iced over, the plane could lose power. If the pressurization system failed, the crew could pass out within minutes. The bomber's greatest strength, its ability to fly high, was also its greatest risk. As the missions continued, something else began to weigh on the crews: the knowledge of what their bombs were doing. The high altitude kept them safe from fighters and flak, but it also meant they rarely saw the destruction firsthand. They dropped their bombs through blankets of clouds, watching only for the distant glow of fires rising from below. Some wondered if distance made the war feel less real. Others said the distance made it harder. When you cannot see the faces of the people below, your mind fills in the details. You imagine families. You imagine fear. The duality of war became clear. The sky offered protection, but it also created emotional distance. It shielded them from danger while exposing them to guilt. As time passed, the B-29 grew into more than a weapon. It became a symbol, a sign of how high human invention could climb, and how helpless opponents became when they could not follow. Japan tried night raids, rocket-powered interceptors, and last hope suicide climbs. But none could match the B-29's capability. The war was shifting and the sky had become the deciding factor. Still, for all its power, the B-29 was flown by humans. Humans who missed home, who feared the silence of the upper atmosphere, who closed their eyes and wondered if they would ever land on familiar ground again. At night, as they flew over endless water, they thought about the people waiting for them. About letters they carried. About promises they hoped to keep. The war slowly reached its final months. Cities burned. Resources dwindled. Fighters crashed before takeoff. The high sky that once protected Japan now held its enemy. It watched quietly as the conflict approached its final turning point. By the time peace arrived, many pilots looked at the sky differently. Some felt grateful. Some felt haunted. But almost all agreed on one thing: the high altitudes had taught them more about themselves than they ever expected to learn. And maybe that is why the story of the B-29 continues to matter. It is not only a story of height and technology. It is a story of human hearts, of courage, of fear, of endurance, and of the strange, quiet wisdom found in the thin air above the world. The sky remembers everything. And through the story of the B-29, so do we. The war was changing shape, but the sky remained the same, cold, wide, and endlessly patient. Every time a B-29 rose from its runway, it carried more than bombs. It carried the weight of fear, hope, and a responsibility that few people on the ground could ever fully understand. For the men inside the bomber, each mission began long before the wheels left the earth. They woke before sunrise, tired but alert, knowing the next hours could decide their lives. They dressed in layers, pulling on thick jackets and gloves to protect themselves from the freezing air that waited above them. They checked their oxygen masks, their parachutes, and the narrow cables that connected each part of the aircraft. On the ground, mechanics and engineers worked with quiet focus. They tightened bolts. They inspected engines. They wiped frost from metal. They knew any small mistake could put the crew in danger thousands of meters above the sea. Then came the moment of takeoff. The engines roared, spitting fire, pushing the huge plane forward. As the wheels lifted, the world below began to shrink, and the men inside felt the strange mix of excitement and fear that always came at the start of a mission. At low altitude, the air felt thick and heavy. The engine noise was loud and comforting. But as the bomber climbed higher, everything began to change. The air thinned. The temperature dropped. The engines worked harder, their sound shifting from a deep roar to a strained, steady hum. Inside the cabin, the crew felt the pressure change. Their ears popped. Their breath became slow and controlled through their oxygen masks. Soon, the land below turned into a patchwork of shapes. Fields looked like small squares. Roads became thin lines. Even mountains appeared soft and distant. Up here, the world seemed peaceful, but it was a fragile peace. The crew knew that at any second something could go wrong. A leak in the oxygen system. A spark in the engine. A sudden icing of the wings. Or a lone fighter that managed to climb just high enough to fire a desperate burst. Yet most of the time, the skies remained quiet. The Japanese fighters struggled long before reaching such heights. Engines overheated. Fuel ran low. The pilots felt dizziness and nausea as the thin air pressed against their lungs. From the cockpit of the B-29, a pilot could sometimes see their enemies below, fast-moving dots circling like birds trying to climb. But the bomber stayed out of reach, almost like a floating island in the sky. For Japan, this was deeply frustrating. The idea that an enemy could strike from a place they could not follow felt like an insult. Japan's air defense forces tried everything. They sent up their best pilots. They created lighter versions of existing fighters. They experimented with powerful engines. They pushed aircraft to their mechanical limits. But every attempt ended the same way: the sky pushed them back. Meanwhile, the B-29s continued their missions. They flew across oceans, through storms, and into the heart of enemy territory. They dropped bombs, then turned home, followed by long hours of silence and cold. Inside the aircraft, the men passed time in their own ways. Some looked out from the gunner windows, watching the clouds drift below. Others stayed focused on their controls, reading instruments again and again to make sure everything was normal. Some thought about home, about warm kitchens, quiet porches, or people waiting for them. Even though the crew shared the same small space, the sky made them feel alone. The silence at high altitude felt almost unreal. It was a silence that carried weight, a silence that made your thoughts louder. At times, the only sound was the steady breathing through oxygen masks and the soft cracking of frost on the windows. But missions were not only about silence. There were moments of fear too. When the bomber approached enemy territory, the crew grew tense. They triple-checked their guns. They scanned the sky for faint shapes. They watched for flashes of anti-aircraft fire. At 30,000 feet, flak didn't always reach them, but sometimes it did. A single explosion in the air could spray metal fragments in all directions. A small piece of shrapnel could tear through the bomber's skin and damage something vital. The crews knew this and they felt it with every passing second. Yet even with all these dangers, one thing made them feel safer than anything else: the enemy's inability to reach their height. It was this single advantage that shaped the final years of the war. The B-29 was more than a machine. It represented rising above limits, above danger, above fear, above the reach of the enemy. Japan understood this. They feared the bomber not only for the destruction it carried, but for the hopelessness it created. How do you fight something you cannot touch? This sense of helplessness grew with each passing month. And as it grew, so did the pressure on Japan's engineers and pilots. They tried one last desperate idea: a rocket-powered interceptor. It launched upward with incredible speed. For a moment, it climbed higher than any other Japanese aircraft. But it carried too little fuel. It burned out quickly and fell back to Earth. Again and again the same story repeated. Meanwhile, the B-29s pushed deeper into Japanese territory, flying missions that lasted 12, sometimes even 15 hours. Crews sat in their seats, cramped and cold, eating small packets of food and drinking from metal flasks. They watched the sun rise in bright orange and set in deep red, all during the same mission. They crossed clouds so thick they looked like mountains. They flew over storms that flashed with lightning beneath them. And though they were safe from enemy fighters, the sky itself did not always show mercy. Sometimes the winds were so strong they pushed the bomber off course. Sometimes ice formed on the wings and slowed the engines. Sometimes a crew member fainted from lack of oxygen, falling over in his seat until others helped him up. The high-altitude world was beautiful, but it was dangerous too. It gave protection, but it demanded respect. As months passed, the war reached its final stretch. Japan struggled to defend its cities. Supplies ran low. Pilots were lost faster than new ones could be trained. The B-29s continued their missions with focus and determination. They believed their flights were helping end the war, though sometimes the cost weighed heavily on their hearts. When peace finally arrived, the skies grew quiet again. The bombers landed for the last time. The engines cooled. The frost melted from the windows. Some pilots walked away without looking back. Others stood for a moment, staring up at the sky, remembering everything it had shown them. Many had mixed feelings. They were proud of their service. They were relieved to be alive. But they also carried memories of fear, responsibility, and the strange loneliness found at the edge of the atmosphere. Even after the war, the story of the B-29 remained powerful. People studied it, wrote about it, and admired its design. But few understood how it truly felt to sit inside one, thousands of meters above the world, trusting metal wings to keep you alive. Today, when we look at the B-29, we see a machine from another time. But the sky remembers. It remembers the roar of engines, the shine of silver wings, the silent flights through cold air, the young men who climbed into a world not made for humans. And as we tell their story, we are reminded of something deeper. Human beings always try to rise above their limits. Sometimes they do it to protect others. Sometimes they do it to change the world. And sometimes they do it simply because they believe they must. The B-29 reached heights no Japanese fighter could follow. But in doing so, it also reached into the hearts of the men who flew it. It taught them courage, fear, endurance, and the high cost of innovation. In the end, the sky holds all these memories. It carries them gently, like echoes fading into thin air. And through stories like this, we hear those echoes once again. The end of the war did not immediately silence the memories carried by those who had flown in the high sky. For many crew members, the return home felt unreal. One day they were sitting in a cold metal aircraft, staring down at burning cities from 30,000 feet. The next day they were walking on warm ground, hearing familiar voices, smelling fresh food, and feeling sunlight without the bite of icy wind. It was a sudden shift from danger to safety, from constant alertness to quiet normal life. And for many that quiet felt almost strange. Some pilots said the sky kept calling them, as if a part of their mind still waited for the engines to roar again. They would wake at night imagining the shaking of the fuselage or the soft hiss of oxygen masks. Others found peace quickly, happy to leave the cold heights behind. But even they remembered the strange beauty of the clouds, the sharp line of the horizon, and the feeling of floating above the world like a silent observer. In Japan, people learned to live with the memory of the silver shapes that passed high above them. For those below, the B-29 had become a symbol of something unreachable, something too high, too distant, too powerful. Many civilians never saw the bomber clearly. They only saw a glint of sunlight, heard a faint hum, and felt the fear of what would follow. The bombers had seemed like ghosts to them, moving quietly through the sky, always out of reach. After the war, engineers and historians tried to explain the altitude problem scientifically. They wrote reports, studied old engines, read pilot notes, and built diagrams showing how air thins with height, how engines lose power, how wings need lift, how oxygen becomes scarce. They explained it clearly, logically, step by step. But the men who had been in the sky knew that charts and numbers could not fully show what those missions truly felt like. They remembered the way the inside of the aircraft creaked as it climbed. They remembered the frost on their masks, the sting on their cheeks, the dull ache in their hands even through thick gloves. They remembered the fear of a sudden leak, the dread of hearing an engine cough, the silence when radios crackled out of range. They remembered the long stretch of ocean beneath them, a cold, dark reminder that survival was not guaranteed. And yet, in those long hours above the earth, they also found moments of calm. Moments when the sky looked so wide and beautiful that it felt like another world. Moments when the rise of the sun poured golden light through the cockpit windows. Moments when the clouds looked like mountains of soft cotton, turning pink and orange with the dawn. Moments that reminded them of why humans dream of flight in the first place. As decades passed, the B-29 became a part of history. Museums placed them in open fields or quiet hangars, polished and still. People walked around them, touched their metal sides, and read the plaques that explained their importance. Children stared at their enormous wings, trying to imagine how something so large could float through the sky. Tourists took pictures, not fully understanding the cold, fear, and bravery once carried inside those walls. To the world, the B-29 became a symbol of innovation. To those who flew it, it was a reminder of youth spent in a dangerous place between Earth and space. A place where fear and beauty lived together. A place where silence meant both safety and threat. A place high above the reach of enemy fighters, but also high above human comfort. When historians tell the story of the bomber's altitude advantage, they often focus on numbers: altitude ceilings, thrust values, engine power, fuel mixes. But the older pilots, when interviewed, speak of something else. They speak of the strange calm that came when the enemy could no longer reach them. They speak of watching Japanese fighters rise in desperate climbs, only to fall away again. They speak of the sadness of seeing a determined opponent fail because nature itself stood against them. They also speak of the responsibility of being untouchable. It made them powerful, but it also made them question the weight of the bombs they carried. Some said that flying so far above the world made everything feel distant, almost dreamlike. Others said the distance made the destruction feel heavier, because they had so much time to think as they flew home across silent skies. In the years after the war, Japan rebuilt, America rebuilt, and the world moved forward. But the sky above the Pacific stayed unchanged. It still carried the same cold winds. It still held the same thin air. It still kept the memory of those long missions hidden in its blue depths. Today, when someone looks at the B-29 in a museum, they might think of it as a giant relic. But those who know its story understand something deeper. They know the bomber was not just a machine that flew higher than its enemies. It was a place of human challenge where young men faced cold wind, thin air, mechanical limits, and the weight of choices made in wartime. And above all, they understand that the true power of the B-29 came not only from its engines or its design, but from the determination of those who stepped into it again and again, rising into a sky that did not welcome them, but that they conquered through courage and endurance. The sky, for both sides of the war, became a teacher. It taught lessons that no classroom, no book, and no commander could ever explain. For the Japanese pilots who climbed until their engines failed, it taught the limits of machines and the limits of the human body. For the American crews who climbed above clouds and storms, it taught the fragile balance between safety and danger. And for everyone who looked up from the ground, it taught the fear of something unreachable. People in Japan often described those high-flying bombers as silver arrows, or distant thunder, or stars moving in the wrong direction. They glowed in the sunlight, far above the reach of any defender. To many civilians, it felt unfair, like they were fighting someone who played by different rules. They heard the bombers long before they saw them. Sometimes the sound was soft, a low hum in the sky. Other times it was a deep vibration that made windows rattle. Mothers held their children close. Old men whispered prayers. Young people stared upward, wondering why nothing could stop the planes. For the soldiers on the ground, this helplessness was even harder. They had trained for years, practiced firing, studied tactics, and memorized procedures. But none of that mattered when the enemy stayed far above their highest defenses. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the air, black clouds bursting far below the bombers. But the explosions faded before they reached the height of the B-29s. The soldiers knew their shots were falling short, but they fired anyway, because doing nothing felt worse. Japan's fighter pilots faced a challenge even more painful. They were brave, skilled, and determined. Many had fought since the early years of the war. But no matter how hard they pulled on the controls, no matter how much they pushed their engines, the sky would not let them climb higher. They watched the bombers rise above them, almost like they were floating into another world. Some pilots described it as chasing a mountain that kept growing taller as they approached it. Every time they thought they were close, the mountain lifted itself again, always out of reach. Meanwhile, inside the B-29, the American crews felt a strange mix of relief and worry. They knew the Japanese fighters were below them, struggling to reach their height. They watched tiny dots moving far beneath the wings, growing smaller as the bomber climbed. That gave them relief. But it also reminded them that they were alone in a dangerous place. Without enemy planes nearby, the sky seemed too quiet. The silence made every small sound feel bigger. A loose screw, a shifting box, or a change in engine rhythm could suddenly feel like a warning. Some crew members said that high-altitude missions changed them as people. They learned to appreciate small things, warm air, soft blankets, and the simple comfort of a breath taken without a mask. They also learned how quickly life could change. One moment they were flying smoothly. The next moment, frost covered the controls, or oxygen levels dropped, or engines became too cold to function. They lived every second with awareness. And yet they also felt wonder. The sky above 30,000 feet held a beauty that seemed untouched by war. The stars looked brighter. The moon looked sharper. The curve of the earth became visible along the horizon. Sometimes the clouds below glowed golden, as if the sun were painting a silent picture just for the men above them. These moments stayed with the pilots for the rest of their lives. But not every mission ended with beauty. Some ended with damage. A wing hit by flak. A tail section frozen. A gunner injured by a stray piece of metal. A fuel leak that forced an early landing. The high sky did not forgive mistakes. Many B-29s never returned. When a bomber failed at that altitude, the fall was long and terrifying. Some crew members survived by parachuting into freezing air. Others were lost forever in the dark ocean. These were the risks no one saw from the ground. People saw the planes glide above the clouds, but they did not see the fear inside, the shaking hands, the whispered hopes, or the silent moments when a pilot wondered if he would see his family again. And while the B-29 had altitude on its side, the men inside were still human. They felt every heartbeat. They felt every shiver. They felt the weight of what their missions meant. In Japan, after the war, some former pilots wrote about their attempts to reach the B-29s. They described the feeling of climbing until their vision blurred, until their engines gasped for air, until the controls tightened under their hands. They knew they were risking their lives. They knew they might never return. But they climbed anyway because they believed it was their duty. Their courage, even in defeat, remains part of this story. And that is why the history of the B-29 is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of humans caught in a moment bigger than themselves. A story of people doing what they believed they had to do. A story of suffering, endurance, and deep sadness on both sides. When peace finally came, the skies became quiet again. The cold winds returned to their natural silence. The clouds drifted peacefully. The blue horizon forgot the sound of engines. and people on both sides tried to rebuild their lives. But the lessons remained. The story of how American B-29s flew higher than any Japanese fighter could reach is more than a lesson in engineering. It is a lesson in limits, human limits, mechanical limits, and the limits of nature itself. It shows how far people will push themselves in times of need. It shows how technology can change a war not just by power, but by reaching a place where the enemy cannot follow. It also reminds us that altitude did not make the war easier. It simply changed the kind of struggle. It protected the bombers from fighters but exposed them to cold, fear, and long hours of pressure. It gave the crews safety from below, but left them vulnerable to the sky above. Today the high sky above the Pacific is quiet. Nothing remains of the battles. No smoke. No sound. Only wind, clouds, and open blue space. But if the sky could speak, it would tell us everything. It would tell us about the men who climbed into its freezing heights. It would tell us about the courage of those who tried to chase them. It would tell us about the silence, the fear, the strength, and the loneliness. And maybe it would remind us of something simple, that even when humans rise to great heights, they carry their humanity with them. Fear, hope, pain, courage, and the desire to survive. The sky, now calm and empty, still holds the echoes of everything that once happened within it. Even today, when jets fly above the Pacific, their trails pass through the same cold air where the B-29s once struggled. Most people do not think about it. They look up, see a plane, and move on. But if they knew the stories hidden in that silence, they might look a little longer. After the war ended, veterans from both sides began to speak openly about their experiences. For many of them, years had passed before they could find the right words. Some said the memories were too heavy. Others said the memories were too cold, like the wind at 30,000 feet. But slowly they began to share what they had seen and felt. American crew members spoke about the strange calm of flying high above the world. They remembered how cities looked from altitude, small, distant, almost unreal. They remembered the glow of fires spreading below them, a sight that stayed with them long after they returned home. Some said it felt like they were watching storms from above, unable to stop the lightning. Others admitted that the silence made the destruction feel even heavier, because they had so much time to think as they flew back over empty oceans. Japanese pilots too shared their stories. They talked about the frustration of climbing toward the B-29s until their engines failed. They spoke with pride about their attempts, even when success was impossible. One pilot wrote that the sky felt like a ceiling made of glass. He could see the enemy clearly, but he could never break through. Another said he felt as if the air itself was pushing him back, refusing to let him rise higher. Both sides respected each other more than many people knew at the time. They recognized courage when they saw it. They understood the fear that lived inside the cockpit, no matter which flag was painted on the wings. When the war ended, these men returned home with stories that did not fit easily into everyday life. They had seen the world from a height where everything looked fragile. They had felt the thin air crush their lungs. They had watched friends suffer frostbite, oxygen failure, or mechanical mishaps. And they had lived with the knowledge that each mission could have been their last. But they also carried memories of unexpected beauty. They remembered how sunrise painted the cockpit with gold. They remembered how stars sparkled untouched by city lights. They remembered the clouds below them, endless, white and soft, hiding the chaos of the world. And maybe this is the secret of the high sky. It shows both the best and the worst of humanity. It shows courage, fear, glory, destruction, loneliness, and hope. It shows that even in war, humans can still look up and feel wonder. In the decades after the war, scientists and historians studied the altitude problem in detail. They explained why the Japanese fighters could not rise high enough. They showed diagrams of wings and air pressure. They calculated engine power limits. They described how turbosuperchargers in the B-29 forced air into the engines, keeping them alive in the thin atmosphere. They wrote articles and made documentaries. But none of these things could explain the emotional truth of being up there. To understand that truth, you have to imagine the moment when a young pilot puts on his oxygen mask, hears the slight hiss of the airflow, and looks out at a world that suddenly feels far away. You have to imagine the cold seeping into his gloves, the metal walls shaking, the deep blue sky stretching out like an ocean of air. You have to imagine him thinking of home, of people waiting for him, of promises he hopes to keep. You have to imagine him knowing that the only thing separating him from the thin, deadly air is a machine made by human hands. You have to imagine him trusting that machine completely. For Japanese pilots, you have to imagine something different. Imagine climbing with all your strength, pushing the joystick forward as your aircraft trembles. Imagine watching the bomber above you grow clearer, then suddenly fade away as your engine loses power. Imagine the frustration, the sadness, the helplessness. Then imagine pointing your nose downward, letting gravity pull you back to safety, knowing that today you cannot reach the enemy. These are the moments that history books cannot fully capture. When we speak of altitude advantage, we often use technical words: ceiling, thrust, oxygen mix, turbo boost. But altitude is not just a number. It is an experience. It is a feeling. It is a boundary between life and death, between safety and danger, between success and failure. The B-29 crossed that boundary. It rose into a place where almost nothing else could follow. And by doing so, it changed the final years of the war. But altitude did not pick sides. It challenged everyone equally. It punished mistakes and rewarded precision. It froze metal and numbed skin. It whispered reminders that humans were not meant to stay in such places for long. In the time after the war, when new technology was invented and modern aircraft reached even higher skies, the story of the B-29 lived on. Not because of its bombs. Not because of its size. But because it was the first plane that truly mastered the cold, thin world above 30,000 feet. It showed humanity what was possible. It showed that the sky had room for those brave enough to enter it. And it showed that the limits of nature could be overcome with determination, skill, and courage. Today, when you see a B-29 resting in a museum, quiet and still, try to imagine it in motion. Imagine the engines roaring. Imagine the wings slicing through thin air. Imagine frost forming on the windows. Imagine the young men inside, breathing through masks, watching the world from a height where everything feels small. Imagine the silence that surrounds them. Imagine the sky listening. In the quiet years after the war, the world below rebuilt itself. Cities rose again. Families came back together. Children played in streets where smoke once drifted. And far above them, the sky remained unchanged. The same cold winds. The same endless blue. The same silence waiting patiently. For the veterans who once flew through that silence, life moved on. They became fathers, grandfathers, teachers, workers, farmers, and neighbors. Many rarely spoke of the missions they flew or the fear they carried. But sometimes, when the sky was especially clear, something inside them stirred. A memory returned. A sound. A feeling. A flash of sunlight on metal wings. And for a moment they were back at 30,000 feet, breathing through a mask, looking out at the world they once crossed in a fragile machine. Some of them returned to see the B-29s in museums. They walked around the aircraft slowly, touching the metal, tracing the outlines of windows where they once sat. They stood under the wings that had carried them across oceans. Some smiled softly. Some felt sadness. Some whispered to themselves. Because they knew what those wings had gone through. They knew the cold. They knew the fear. And they knew the strength it took to keep flying. Japanese veterans did the same. They visited old airfields and stood before the planes they had once flown. They remembered the long climbs, the shaking engines, the moments when the sky refused to let them rise higher. They remembered their friends, their struggles, and their hopes. And many felt respect, deep respect, for the men they had once fought against. Time had taken away the uniforms, the flags, and the orders. What remained was something shared, the memory of a sky that had challenged them both. In the end, the high sky taught everyone the same lesson. It taught that limits exist, but so does determination. It taught that technology can shape history, but it is humans who give technology its meaning. It taught that even in moments of conflict, courage can be found on every side. Above all, it taught that the sky belongs to no nation. It is a place of silence, a place that watches, a place that remembers. The story of how American B-29s flew higher than any Japanese fighter could reach is a story of altitude, yes. But it is also a story of youth, of fear, of ambition, of a race between human invention and the laws of nature. and of the quiet truth that the sky itself becomes a witness to everything that passes through it. Today, when we look up, we see airplanes crossing high above, leaving thin white trails behind them. They fly higher and faster than the B-29 ever could. But the foundation for those flights, the courage to enter the cold thin air, the belief that humans could conquer altitude, began with the men who dared to push through that invisible barrier during the war. So when you see a plane gliding across the blue, remember that the sky once held stories of struggle and survival. Stories of engines that fought for air. Stories of pilots who fought fear. Stories of nations separated by war, but united by the same wind. The same clouds. The same longing to rise. The high sky remains. Silent. Endless. Watching. And somewhere in that silence, if you could listen closely enough, you might still hear the faint echo of those four powerful engines. The roar softens as it climbs. The air thins. The world below fades. And the B-29 rises once more into the part of the sky where history was written, and where no enemy could follow.